John Matthews, a seasoned delivery man, steps out of his truck with a heavy, unmarked package. As he walks toward the house, faint cries seep from inside the box, almost inaudible at first. The sound grows louder, human-like, desperate, confused. John stops in his tracks, his heart pounding. He's delivered countless packages before, but this one feels different. His curiosity rises, and with each step toward the door, the cries become undeniable. What could possibly be inside? It was another ordinary morning for John Matthews. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, thin shadows over the suburban streets as he made his usual rounds. As a delivery man for the past decade, he had become accustomed to the predictable rhythm of his job. The early mornings, the miles of quiet streets, and the boxes stacked neatly in his truck, ready to be dropped off at their respective destinations. This neighborhood, in particular, felt familiar. The houses were neat, the lawns well-kept, and the air was crisp with the promise of a new day. John had delivered to this street dozens of times before. He could almost do it in his sleep, one package after another, a routine he knew well. But this time was different. The first package he picked up was heavier than expected, almost unnaturally so. He raised an eyebrow at it, wondering if perhaps the contents had shifted during transport, but it wasn't until he took a few steps toward the front porch that he felt it, a faint vibration coming from the box. It wasn't just the weight of it. Something inside was moving. John paused, staring at the box in his hands. He brushed it off for a moment, chalking it up to a malfunctioning device or a fragile object inside. But as he continued toward the door, he heard it again. Faint cries, muffled but unmistakable. His pulse quickened, and a chill ran down his spine. John had delivered thousands of packages in his time, but this was different. He couldn't ignore the sound. It was human, desperate, and growing louder by the second. He stopped at the doorstep, confused and unsettled. The cries were unmistakable now, and whatever was inside the box needed help. But who would send a package like this? His instinct screamed at him to walk away, but something in the pit of his stomach told him he couldn't. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. John stood on the porch, the weight of the package in his hands suddenly feeling much heavier than before. The faint cries that had started as little more than a whisper were now unmistakable, louder, more frantic. He hesitated, unsure whether he was overreacting. But the cries continued, louder now, almost as if they were pleading for help. The discomfort grew in his chest. He had never encountered anything like this, and it didn't feel right. He stepped back from the door, scanning the windows of the house. The blinds were closed, and there was no sign of life inside. He knocked once, twice, but still, no answer. The silence that followed was unsettling. There should have been someone, anyone, inside. The cries were almost deafening now, and John felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. His mind raced, trying to rationalize the situation. Could it be an animal? He had heard of pets being shipped in packages before, but this was different. This wasn't the sound of an animal. It was something human. He looked at the address on the package again, hoping for a clue, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just another delivery to make. John found himself turning back to the package, unable to ignore the growing urgency in the cries. With a shaking hand, he carefully sliced through the tape, holding the flaps of the box shut. The noise inside shifted as he cut through, and for a brief moment, everything went still. He paused, feeling his heartbeat quicken. What if he was doing something wrong? What if there was someone inside who needed help, but he was about to make things worse? He tore open the last bit of tape, pulling back the cardboard. The flaps of the box unfolded, revealing what lay inside. John froze. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. Inside the box was a small, frail girl, no more than 10 years old. She was curled up in a tight ball, her body trembling violently as she hugged her knees to her chest. She was covered in dirt and grime, and her clothes were torn, as though she had been through something brutal. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. John's heart raced, his mouth dry as he knelt beside the girl. "Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice unsteady as he gently reached out to her. "You're safe now." But she didn't respond. She couldn't have been more than a few feet from him, but she seemed distant. Her eyes locked on the floor of the box. Her body curled into herself as though she was trying to disappear. The cries that had once been muffled were now silent, but the fear that radiated from her was palpable. "Who did this to you?" John muttered to himself, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone. He knew he needed to call the authorities, but as his thumb hovered over the call button, he hesitated. Something didn't feel right. Why was she left here? Why was she in a box? And why had no one been here to receive her? Before he could make the call, the sound of footsteps from inside the house caught his attention. He turned quickly, feeling his pulse spike. A man was standing in the doorway now, his face calm, but his eyes locked onto John with an unsettling intensity. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and his expression was unreadable. "You shouldn't have opened it," the man said, his voice flat, almost too calm. There was no emotion in his words, just cold certainty. John's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean by that? John stood up quickly, instinctively moving closer to the girl. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaky with a mix of fear and confusion. "What's going on here?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped further into the doorway, his gaze not leaving John for a second. "You've made a mistake," he said. "By opening that package, you've become part of something much larger than you realize." John's breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" he asked, taking a step back, his gaze darting between the girl and the man. "Who are you? What do you want with her?" The man's cold smile never faltered. "You'll understand soon enough. But for now, you need to know that you've crossed a line. You've opened the box, and now you're involved." John's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. The man's words didn't make sense. This was just a delivery, just another day on the job. But now, it seemed like everything had changed in an instant. "Get away from her," John demanded, his voice shaky, but firm. He took a step toward the man, his instincts telling him to protect the girl. But the man didn't flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, as if he had been expecting this reaction. "You've opened the box," the man repeated. "Now you're part of it." John stood frozen, staring at the girl, her wide eyes filled with terror as she huddled in the box. She didn't speak, but her trembling body screamed 1,000 words of fear. John was at a loss, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding before him. What had happened to her? Who would send a child in such a state, trapped in a box? His mind raced with questions, but none of them made sense. The man, who had appeared at the doorway, wasn't moving. He was calm, unnervingly so. As John looked at him, he realized that there was something off about him too, something unsettling in the cold, calculating way he observed the scene. The man wasn't reacting like someone who had just discovered an innocent child in a box. It was as if he expected this situation to play out exactly as it was. "You should leave," John said, his voice shaking with urgency. He instinctively took a step toward the girl, positioning himself between her and the stranger. "I don't know who you are, but I won't let you hurt her." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand slowly, as if measuring John's every movement. "You don't understand. It's too late for you. You've already opened the package." John's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, too late? What is this? Why is she in that box? What are you doing here?" The man's eyes narrowed, as if contemplating whether or not to answer. Then, finally, he spoke. "You've just made a decision, whether you know it or not. By opening that box, you've become part of something larger. You're in the middle of an operation, one that you cannot walk away from." John felt a chill run down his spine. Operation? What the hell was this man talking about? "I'm just a delivery man," John protested. "I'm not involved in anything. I didn't sign up for any operation." The man's lips curled into a thin smile, his expression growing colder by the second. "That's what you think. But you've already been chosen, John. There's no turning back now." John looked down at the girl, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. She looked like she was barely holding it together, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her gaze locked with his for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. John could feel it. This girl had seen far more than she should have at her age, and it was clear she wasn't just a victim in this situation. She was part of something bigger too, something that John was only beginning to realize. The man stepped forward then, his presence suffocating. "You're asking questions that have no answers for you right now, John. The only thing that matters is this. You're part of it now, whether you like it or not." John clenched his fists, trying to keep his cool despite the growing fear in his chest. "What do you want from me? What have you done to her?" The man's gaze softened slightly, but there was no kindness in it, only a cold, detached understanding. "She's not the only one, John. She's one of many. You're involved in an operation that has been running for years. You weren't meant to open that box, but now that you have, you're part of it." John stepped back, his mind racing. He couldn't understand. An operation? People trapped in boxes? What kind of twisted game was this man playing? He had to get out of there, had to call the authorities. But something told him it wasn't going to be that simple. Before he could move toward his truck, the man spoke again, his voice cutting through John's thoughts like a knife. "You've made a choice. You don't have control here anymore." John's pulse quickened. "What do you mean by that?" The man stepped toward him, his cold eyes never leaving John's face. "You're going to help us, whether you want to or not. You're involved now, John. There's no way out." John turned toward the girl, his instincts telling him he needed to get her to safety, but the reality of the situation weighed on him. The man wasn't just a stranger. He was a part of this operation, whatever it was, and he wasn't about to let John leave without a deeper understanding of the role he had just been forced into. Suddenly, the girl spoke, her voice barely a whisper, but sharp with clarity. "They've been watching you. They know who you are. You've been marked. There's no escape." John turned back to her, his heart sinking as her words hit him like a freight train. She knew more than she was letting on, but there was no time to ask. He needed to act fast, but every move he made felt like a trap. The man stepped back, his hands folding behind his back as he watched John process the information. "You're a participant now, a part of the system. Whether you help us or not doesn't matter. The clock is ticking." John's head was spinning. He was just a delivery man. How had he gotten caught up in something so monstrous? What was this operation the man kept referring to? What had the girl meant by marked? There were more questions than answers, but John knew one thing for certain now. He couldn't leave. Not without understanding the full scale of what he was involved in. He had to know what this was, and he had to protect the girl, even if it meant stepping deeper into whatever dark world the man was a part of. John's mind was racing, trying to piece together the cryptic words of the man and the girl. He had never imagined that a single act of curiosity, opening a package, would lead him into this nightmare. He was trapped, stuck in a situation with no clear way out. And the more the man spoke, the more it became clear. He wasn't just delivering packages anymore. He had been pulled into a vast, twisted operation. The man had stepped back slightly, as if giving John space to process the revelation. The girl, still trembling, had not moved. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes cast downward, her silence deafening. "Do you understand now?" the man asked, his voice almost cold in its calmness. "You weren't just delivering a package. You were chosen. You've become part of a much larger plan. A plan that you cannot undo." John swallowed hard. "What is this? What do you mean chosen?" "I'm just a delivery man. I don't even know who you are or what you're talking about." The man's lips curled into a thin smile, almost as if he were amused by John's confusion. "The operation is bigger than you can imagine. It's a network that uses people like you, people who are just passing through the cracks, unnoticed. You were chosen because you were in the right place at the right time. You were in the business of delivering things. But now, you're part of the delivery process yourself." John took a step back, his head spinning. Chosen? What was he really being dragged into? He had no answers. Just endless questions. This couldn't be happening. He had opened a package. That was it. But now, the man was telling him it was something bigger, something that had been planned for a long time. "Why? Why me?" John asked, his voice shaky. He needed answers. He had to understand why this was happening. The man stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Because you're a part of the system, a cog in the machine. You open the box, and now you're here. This isn't just about delivering goods. She was so young, too young for whatever this operation was, too young to be a part of such a dark world. You're going to help us, whether you want to or not, the man said, his voice low and final. Now that you've opened the box, there's no turning back. You've made a choice. You may not know it yet, but you've made it. John's breath caught in his throat. Help you? He didn't want to be a part of whatever this man was talking about, but it was clear now that he didn't have a choice. The man had already decided for him. You can't force me to do this, John said, his voice shaking with fear and anger. He had to keep his cool, had to think. He was in way over his head, but he couldn't just give up. I'm not involved in any of this. I'm leaving. The man's smile faded, and for the first time, John saw a hint of anger flicker in his eyes. You think you can walk away? The man asked, his voice chillingly calm. You're already involved. You're already part of the operation. If you walk away, if you refuse, you'll become a part of something much worse. John's pulse quickened. What do you mean? What could be worse than this? The man's expression hardened. Once you open the box, there's no going back. You think you can escape? You think the authorities will help you? You're now part of an organization that will do whatever it takes to maintain control. You won't be able to run. You'll be marked. And we will find you. John felt a wave of panic wash over him, but he couldn't show it. He couldn't let the man see his fear. I don't care. I'll go to the police. I'll tell them everything. The man chuckled softly, as though John's words were amusing. You can try, but we're not amateurs. You're already part of the system. You're just a delivery man now, John. One of many. You transport the subjects, and you never ask questions. You just deliver. John stared at the man, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about a simple delivery. It was about an operation that had been running in the shadows, controlling everything. John wasn't just a part of this man's world. He had been forced into it. He didn't understand it, didn't know how deep it ran. But the girl, her terrified eyes, were proof that this was no mistake. The man gestured toward the door. It's time for you to meet the others. You'll understand soon enough what your role is. But there's no turning back, John. Not now. Not ever. John wanted to run. He wanted to fight. But he knew that he was caught in something far bigger than him. And as he turned toward the door, the girl's haunted gaze stayed with him. She was part of this, too. And somehow, he knew. He was going to have to find a way to survive it, or die trying. John's mind raced. Every word the man spoke seemed to seal his fate even further. The girl, the strange operation, the cold and calculating way the man spoke. It was all too much for him to process. The weight of his situation crashed down on him, each new revelation feeling like another layer of his life being ripped away. Look, John said, his voice trembling but filled with urgency. I don't know what kind of twisted operation you've got going here, but I'm not going to be a part of it. You can't force me to. You're already a part of it. The man interrupted, his tone final. You're here now. You've made your choice the moment you opened that box. You're involved. There's no going back. John's heart raced. He was starting to understand, but he wasn't ready to accept it. How could he be? He had opened a package. He was just doing his job. He hadn't signed up for anything. But the more the man spoke, the more he realized that his fate had already been decided for him. The man stepped closer, his eyes hard and calculating. You can resist all you want, but this is bigger than you, John. This is bigger than anything you can imagine. You've now joined the ranks of countless others who have become part of the system. John clenched his fists, a surge of anger rising in him. No, I won't be part of your sick system. I'll leave. I'll go straight to the authorities. The man's expression softened into a knowing smile, but it was anything but comforting. You think the authorities can help you? You think they have any idea about what's really going on here? He shook his head. There's no getting out of this. You're just another delivery man in a long line of people who thought they could escape. You're just a cog in the machine now. John's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. He had to find a way out. He couldn't be part of whatever this was. There had to be a way out. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just some sick conspiracy. This was real. The girl, the way the man spoke, the eerie calmness of everything. It was all part of something much larger, something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. "We'll get started with you soon enough," the man said, glancing at his watch. "But first, I want to show you the full scope of the operation. You need to understand exactly what's at stake here." John's stomach churned as the man walked toward a door at the far end of the room, motioning for John to follow. The girl remained silent, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if resigned to her fate. John glanced at her, unsure whether she could hear his silent plea for answers, but she didn't move. Her silence only confirmed the worst. She was used to this life, whatever it was, and it had already broken her. The man opened the door to reveal a large, dimly lit room filled with monitors and equipment. John felt a cold shiver run through him as he stepped inside. The room was sterile and clinical, like something out of a science fiction horror movie. The walls were lined with tall shelves, each filled with devices he didn't recognize. On the far side of the room, large screens flashed with images he couldn't immediately make sense of. "This is where it all happens," the man said, his voice low. "The subjects are brought in, processed, and moved according to the needs of the operation. We've been doing this for years. And now, you're part of it." John felt a knot form in his stomach. He had seen things like this in movies, but he never imagined he would actually be standing in a room like this, part of something so monstrous. His body was on autopilot, his mind still fighting against the reality that was unfolding before him. The man stepped aside, motioning toward the screens. "Take a look. You'll see what happens when people get involved in the operation. You'll understand why you have no choice now." John's eyes flicked to the screens. At first, he didn't want to believe what he was seeing. The monitors flickered to life, showing images of people, other subjects, just like the girl, strapped to tables, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies limp. The images were blurry at first, but as they cleared, John could see the full horror of what he was looking at. The subjects were hooked up to machines, their bodies twisted and unnatural. Some were crying out in terror, their voices muted by the equipment. Others lay completely still, their faces blank, drained of all emotion. John's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. These weren't just victims. They were people who had been broken, used in this operation. Their eyes told a story of suffering beyond anything he could comprehend. The man's voice interrupted his thoughts. "This is what happens to the ones who resist. They're processed, reprogrammed, or discarded. But you have a choice, John. You can cooperate, and you'll be treated with respect. Or you can resist, and you'll end up like them." John's stomach turned. He had seen enough. "You're sick," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This is wrong. You can't just treat people like this." The man smiled, his expression unfazed. "You're starting to understand, but it's too late to go back now. You're already involved." John turned to leave, but the man's next words stopped him dead in his tracks. "You will either help us, John, or you will become part of the experiment. Either way, you will do what we ask. Your role is already sealed." John's heart was pounding in his chest, the images on the monitors still flashing in his mind. He had seen it now, the true face of the operation. There was no turning back. The people on the screens, the subjects who had been processed and broken, had become mere tools in a ruthless system. And John was being forced to play a role in it, whether he liked it or not. But there was something inside him, something primal, a spark of resistance, that refused to bow to this. He wasn't going to let this man control him. He wasn't going to be part of this sick experiment, not without a fight. "You can't make me do this," John said, his voice shaking but filled with a steady defiance. He turned away from the monitors and toward the man, who stood motionless by the door, his eyes unwavering. "I won't be part of this. I'll never be a part of your operation." The man's face remained impassive. There was no anger, no frustration in his expression. Instead, he looked almost amused, as if John's words were a form of entertainment for him. "You're already part of it, John," he said softly. "You're just too blinded by your own sense of morality to see it. You opened the box. You made the choice." John felt his anger rising. His fists clenched at his sides, and he took a step toward the man. I didn't choose this. I didn't ask for any of this. You think you can just force me into your twisted game? The man's eyes narrowed, but there was no change in his calm demeanor. You've been part of this system your entire life, John. You just didn't know it. You're just a cog in a much larger machine. You were always going to be chosen. All you had to do was open the box. John's head was spinning, the weight of the man's words sinking in. This wasn't just some isolated event. The operation had been going on for years, quietly pulling people into its web, using them and discarding them when they were no longer useful. And now, John was in it. His only choice was to either comply or face the consequences. But he wasn't going to comply. He took a deep breath, his chest tight with fear, but his resolve firm. I'm not going to play your game. I'll leave. I'll walk away and tell the police everything. The man stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. You can try, John. You can try all you want. But you're already marked. You're already involved. And once you're part of this, you can't leave. You won't be able to walk away. The network will find you. They'll make sure of it. John's eyes flashed with fury, but the man's words hit home. He was right. There was no walking away from this. The operation was too vast, too powerful. There were no safe havens, no escape routes. But the thought of being forced into this world, of becoming just another cog in their system, made something snap inside him. He wasn't going to give in, not without a fight. John lunged forward, his body fueled by pure adrenaline. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he had to act. He had to break free. But before he could get any closer to the man, two figures stepped out from the shadows, grabbing John's arms with inhuman strength. "Let go of me," John shouted, struggling against their grip. He kicked and punched, but the figures were too strong, their hands like iron on his arms. They forced him to the ground, pinning him with brutal efficiency. The man stood above him, watching with cold detachment. "You can resist all you want, John. It won't change anything. We're in control now." John's chest heaved as he gasped for breath, the weight of his situation pressing down on him. His body screamed in pain, but his mind remained sharp, burning with defiance. He wasn't going to let them break him. "Don't you understand?" the man continued, kneeling down to look John in the eye. "You're part of this now. You opened the box. You've crossed the line, and there's no going back. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. But in the end, you will submit. You will play your role." John's vision blurred with tears of frustration. His body was bruised, his hands shaking with the effort of trying to break free, but he refused to let the man see him bend. "You'll never control me," John spat, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll die before I do what you want." The man stared at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood up and signaled to the figures holding John down. "Take him to the processing room," he ordered coldly. John's heart sank. The processing room? What did that even mean? The fear that had been gnawing at him grew stronger, but he refused to show it. He wasn't going to be broken. As the figures pulled him to his feet and began dragging him down the hallway, John's mind raced. There had to be a way out. He couldn't give up. There had to be someone, somewhere, who could help him. He wouldn't let these people win. He couldn't. But as they dragged him deeper into the building, the reality of his situation began to settle in. No one was coming for him. He was alone. And this was where it all ended. This was where the operation would make him part of the system. John's mind raced as the figures dragged him through the narrow, dimly lit hallway. His feet stumbled with each step, and his chest tightened, but he refused to show any weakness. He had to hold on. He couldn't let them break him. He clenched his fists, feeling the cold grip of reality sink in. This was it, the point of no return. The guards, silent as ever, yanked him through a heavy steel door, and John was met with a sight that made his blood run cold. The room beyond was large and sterile, lined with cold metal tables and strange equipment he couldn't identify. The air felt heavy with the weight of the unknown. Monitors blinked and flashed in the far corners of the room, but it wasn't the machinery that made John's stomach churn. It was the people. Figures lay strapped to the tables, their bodies limp, their faces pale. They looked like nothing more than hollow shells, drained of life and will. Some were unconscious, others were awake but staring vacantly into space, their expressions blank, devoid of any human emotion. And as his eyes swept across the room, John could see that none of them were there by choice. They had been transformed into something else, something he couldn't fully comprehend, but something he would never forget. The figures who had been dragging him through the hall pushed him toward a table in the center of the room. John's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he thought he might suffocate on the fear closing in around him. "No, no, you can't do this to me," he gasped, struggling against their grip. His voice was hoarse, filled with the raw desperation of a man who knew he was losing control over his own fate. One of the figures spoke for the first time, his voice flat and emotionless. "We don't have a choice. Neither do you." John's pulse quickened. He fought against them, but it was useless. They were too strong, and his body was too weak from the strain. The guards pinned him down onto the cold metal table, and despite his efforts, they strapped his wrists and ankles down with the cold, unfeeling precision of a machine. "This is your final choice, John," the man from earlier said, stepping forward with a cruel, cold smile. "You can cooperate, and you will be given a role. You'll be used, yes, but you'll be alive. You'll be spared the fate of those who resist." John's mind reeled, his body thrashing against the restraints. "You think I'll just give in to you? You think I'll let you do this to me? I'm not like them." The man's smile faded slightly, but the cold amusement never left his eyes. "You're already like them, John. You've opened the box. You're already one of us. You just don't know it yet." A sharp jolt of panic surged through John's body. One of us? He wasn't like them. He couldn't be. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how powerless he really was. He had opened the box, and that had sealed his fate. He wasn't just an innocent bystander anymore. He was part of this twisted system. John's breath hitched as the man continued, his voice low and threatening. "There's no escape, John. You will participate in the operation, whether you like it or not. This is bigger than you. This is bigger than your will, your morals. And this is the end of your freedom." John closed his eyes, feeling the suffocating weight of his situation closing in. He had tried to resist. He had fought with every ounce of his being. But now, as the man's cold words echoed in his mind, he realized he was running out of time. He was trapped in a system that had no place for rebellion, no place for escape. And he was powerless to stop it. The sound of the machines powering up filled the room, and John's heart raced. He could feel the cold metal of the table pressing against his back, the restraints digging into his wrists and ankles, and the fear that gripped his chest like a vice. He wasn't just part of this operation. He was about to become the experiment. Tears welled in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He would not give them the satisfaction. His body screamed in protest as the machines began their work, their cold, mechanical whirring filling his ears. His body tensed, every muscle straining against the restraints, but it was all for nothing. The machines began to hum, and a sharp, burning pain shot through his body, making him gasp. "Please, stop," John whispered, his voice trembling with the unbearable pain. But his words fell on deaf ears. The operation was taking over, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The man leaned closer, watching John with cold, calculating eyes. "You see, John," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "this is your place now. You belong to the system. You are part of something much larger than yourself. And in the end, you will do as you're told." John's eyes fluttered as the pain intensified, his thoughts growing foggy. He could feel his consciousness slipping, but there was one thing he held on to with all his remaining strength: defiance. Even if it meant nothing now, he refused to give in completely. He would fight until the end. John's mind was a haze of pain, his body racked with the torment of the machines as they continued their work. The cold, mechanical hum filled the room, grinding his body and mind into submission. Every nerve screamed for release, but he refused to give in. He couldn't. Not like this. His thoughts were scattered, memories of his life before this nightmare slipping through his fingers like sand. The man's words echoed in his ears, cold and unforgiving. You're part of the system now. John knew it. He could feel the chains tightening around him, could feel the world closing in. This wasn't just an experiment. It was a process, a dehumanizing cycle designed to break him, to reshape him into something else, something that would comply with the operation. He had tried to resist. With everything he had fought back. But the reality of his situation settled over him now like a heavy fog. There was no escaping it, no walking away from it. He was part of the machine, just like the others. He had been marked the moment he opened that box. But even as the machines continued their cruel work, John's defiance burned in his chest. He couldn't give in completely. He wouldn't. He clung to the thought, fragile as it was, that there was still something left of him that they couldn't take. They could control his body, but they couldn't control his spirit. With every ounce of strength he had left, John whispered a vow to himself. This won't be the end of me. His body might have been broken. His mind might be on the brink of collapse, but his defiance would survive. It would pass on, a spark that would one day ignite someone else to fight back. He wouldn't let them erase him completely. His breathing became shallow, his consciousness flickering, but the thought of resistance, however small it might seem, remained. Weeks passed, and the operation continued its cruel work, moving people like pawns on a chessboard. The girl, too, became part of the system, her fate sealed like so many before her. But in the quietest corners of the world, whispers began to spread. Whispers of a man who had fought back, a man who refused to accept his place in the system. John's name became a symbol, a spark in the dark, a reminder that resistance was possible, even if it seemed hopeless. The operation, vast and far-reaching as it was, had never counted on the defiance of someone like John. His story was not over, even if his body had been broken. There were those who would carry on his fight. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and one day, when the time was right, someone would finish what he had started. The operation, for all its power, could not control everything. It could break people, silence them, but it could not extinguish the fire of resistance. The legacy of John Matthews, the man who refused to give up, lived on in the hearts of those who would one day rise against the system. And when they did, the operation would crumble, just as the man had hoped.